Hey, welcome. Good to see you, or good to imagine you. Jonathan Foust here. Welcome to this meditation and Dharma talk. A few things before we launch in. A couple of changes. For the summer, we will not be having mindful dialogue after class. We're going to give Ray and Tara the summer off, or the rest of the summer off. And this class is going to be about an hour. So we're going to shorten things up a little bit, shorter meditation. Some quick thank yous. Thank you so much to our producers, to Glenn Harrison and Leo Gimo for all the work and care you put into this. Our mindful movement teacher today, mindful movement, 6:30 Eastern Standard Time, and then this talk. And you can get all those links on my website and on Facebook. I've got a newsletter with photography and all my summaries of talks and so forth. And thank you for your support to keep this going. This is all offered freely, and your generosity really, really makes a difference. Let's hop right into our meditation, and then I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction to the interview coming up with Rachel Krantz. So if you like, reach your arms up overhead. Ooh, let out any sounds. In fact, let's do a little something to make this a little more dramatic, because we don't have as long as we normally do for this meditation. Reach your arms up overhead, and then if you would, bring your elbows parallel to your shoulders, palms facing in. Begin to deepen your breath. Draw your navel in toward the spine. Simultaneously draw your shoulder blades close together. If you like, you can close your eyes. Slow, smooth, deep breath. Actively pull the shoulder blades together as you breathe up under the collarbones on the inhalation. You're lengthening the muscles that get shortened from slumping, and you're taking the slack out of the muscles that get lengthened from slumping. Let's say 3 more breaths. Long, slow, full and deep. Inhaling as you draw the breath up under the collarbones. As you exhale, drawing the navel in toward the spine. And then slowly reach your arms up overhead. Alternate as you stretch up to the heels of the hands. And then let your hands begin a slow motion descent. If you like, you can do this ultra slow. Make this part of your meditation. Begin now to explore this process of settling. Allowing your awareness just to notice the space around you, the air touching the skin. You might explore as to what might soften or relax or let go right now. Relaxing your tongue. Relax the muscles of your face. Feel your face smooth, like the face of a marble statue. You might take a few moments to contact the sense of the weight and the heaviness of your arms. And imagine the perception of the weight, the heaviness, the volume of your arms, and drawing you into a deeper sense of relaxation. Could you soften the palms of the hands? Could you soften the belly? Could you in any way relax or soften the soles of your feet? Just sensing now if there's anything anywhere inside that could relax or soften or let go in any way. And very gently now, you might escort your attention to an anchor of your choosing, perhaps the movement of the breath on the inside, perhaps to the sounds around you, perhaps even this feeling in the palms. Whatever anchor you choose, let this be your connection to the here and now. Exploring deep relaxation right here at the point of your anchor, of breath or sound, the feeling in the palms. Is it possible to sustain your attention on this sense of here and now, right at the point of your anchor? When you notice your awareness lost in the narrative or commentary, you might just smile inwardly, like training a puppy. Invite your attention back, re-relax, and re-engage with your anchor. Re-arriving and re-relaxing and receiving the moment. You might notice as you relax and re-arrive this arising of the witness, this perspective of the observer, without preference, without judgment, just simply awake to what is here. And you might, if you like, broaden your awareness beyond your anchor, opening up to the field of change, to the flow of your experience. Is it possible to relax, to notice what's happening, and to allow it to be just as it is? In these remaining minutes, you might refresh the practice. What could relax or soften inside right now? You might again feel the tongue. Relax the tongue. And the palms. The belly and lower back. The soles of the feet and the heels. Over the next few breaths, how intimately can you feel and experience your anchor from the inside? noticing what's happening, noticing what's changing, and sensing if you can let things be just as they are. Notice now where you feel the breath on the inside. You might slowly deepen and lengthen your breath, just tracking the movement of the breath. In your own time, letting your head drift a little bit to the left and the right. You might reach your arms up overhead. Take some time to stretch and move in any way that feels good for you. No hurry, there's no rush. And when you're ready, if you like, you can let your eyes open or you can remain with your eyes closed. What follows is an interview with one of my favorite people, Rachel Krantz. Rachel is an award-winning investigative journalist and published author. She recently started a podcast called Help Existing, which is really cool. It's a very cool concept, and she's done some great interviews. I really encourage you to check out her podcast. And this is an interview on figuring out the most important thing. When you're caught between ideas, when you have to decide what you're going to do, like changing careers or having kids, or where you best spend your time. How do you identify that? That's our conversation, and I think you'll enjoy Rachel. She's a bright light, and it's a joy to speak with her. So what follows is help figuring out the most important thing, my conversation with Rachel Krantz. Enjoy.
Hi, Jonathan. Thanks so much for having this conversation.
Well, I'm really delighted to have this time with
Thanks.
you.
Yeah, I always get so much out of our talks. Um, okay, so I thought to start off with this theme, it might be uh, good to talk about a phrase I've heard you use on your podcast before. The most important thing is to remember the most important thing. Wait, is that a story that it comes from? I'm not remembering, or just a phrase.
If I recall correctly, that's from Shunryu Suzuki, who is considered one of the great, Zen masters who wrote Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, and it's just such a great line. You know, the most important thing is to know what the most important thing is. And what I love about that is the most important thing, it changes. And there's also this process of when you kind of live in the question of what is the most important thing, it's actually an incredibly cathartic process. And it's kind of along the lines of Ramana Maharshi, who is, considered one of the great sages of India. Amazing story about his awakening, but he taught, self-inquiry as a technique, which is where you're living deeply into a question. And what he claimed, at least in my probably flawed, um, hallucinating filled interpretation, is that there are two questions that if you stay with them, they'll just strip away everything and leave you with, a sense of your true nature. The first one is, who are you? But the second one is, what do you really, really want? which is another version of the most important thing is to know what the most important thing is. And I've done some incredibly grueling retreats where you sit across from another person and they ask you, please tell me, what do you really, really want? And then you have to, I mean, the practice is to sincerely desire to tune into that and then communicate what arises. And inevitably, we start off with like, I want a motorboat. I want to, I want a nice house. I want those shoes. Um, but then when you stay with the inquiry, you stay with the question, it's like, is that really what I want? Well, what do I really want? So that whole thing of like, what's the most important thing is is a question that really burns everything off, I find. And what I find is I sort of have like multiple layers where I can apply that question. Like if I'm going to make a like even in anticipating our conversation, like well, what's the most important thing? And then to pause and listen. And well, the most important thing is to enjoy my time with you because I always do. So to enjoy my time with you and to be as open and present as I can be. So there's sort of like the short term, what's the most important thing? And then there's the what's the really the most important thing question that I find so
Hmm.
powerful.
That's great. And I think some people listening, might say, but I thought that Buddhist thought is all about letting go of desires and also a sense of separate self. So why would you be asking yourself, what do I want? Who am I? Is that
Yeah.
in conflict with those ideas of not being so driven by desire or self oriented thoughts?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, it's a great question because, here's this question of like, well, if desires are the problem, why have desires? You know? But then another interpretation is, well, they're wholesome desires, like the desire to be more compassionate, the desire to be awake, the desire to have a livelihood that not only works for you, but works for everybody. The desire to be of service, to be of genuine service to others. You could say those are wholesome desires, and you can also make an argument, well, there's still an I in there who's choosing, and we need to blow that I out of the water. But I think on a relative scale, having wholesome desires can be
Mhm.
wholesome.
Yeah, definitely. And and part of
Yeah,
what you were
yeah,
saying earlier too about that exercise of digging deeper, but what do you really want? But what do you really want? I was thinking that a nice companion might be actually a teaching I learned from your wife, Tara Brock, that ended up in my book and that I've noticed is probably the most underlined line in the e-reader version of my book. And that's just the teaching of um, and what would that give you? And what would that give you? And what would that give you of asking when you
mhm,
have a desire? In that case, she was referring more to like an addictive desire, a less wholesome desire, that you could dig down to what is the core need, or to be loved, to be present is usually underneath all the to be at ease, and then you practice trying to just give yourself that feeling regardless of circumstances and conditions. So I was just thinking as you were speaking of, maybe I wonder, when we dig down of these desires of what we want, um that are more these wholesome desires of what we want to achieve in our life, who we want to be, if it's useful to also have that question in mind of, and what would that give you, is sort of an idea of what the values behind those aspirations are.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think what we all really want is to be happy, you know? And what often happens is we live in this world of duality, and so we assume that that happiness can be satisfied through the senses. So that iPhone, that's going to make me happy. And as I've said, with the exception of a few select Apple products, nothing material is going to make you permanently happy. You know, so I love that the idea of like form and essence. Like we have the form that we think is going to make us happy. the relationship that's going to make us happy, the child that's going to make us happy, the child who's finally going to leave the house that's going to make us happy, and then like the real, and again, it's sort of we start off in the relative world, but then it moves us to the unconditioned world, is because there's happiness that is achieved through the senses, and then there's happiness that's not reliant on anything. And that's where it gets a little woo woo, but it's also where it really points toward our true nature. Is it possible to be happy independent of externals?
Mhm. Yes,
So that's kind of juicy stuff, I find.
definitely.
And I also find myself still pretty reliant on externals.
Yeah, that's the work of a lifetime, I guess, or many lifetimes, depending
Mhm,
on your
mhm.
opinion. Um,
Yeah,
I mean, I
yeah.
was thinking about how when I first met you, it was very much with this question in mind. I came to you after listening to your podcast. I kind of just reached out cold and asked for counsel because I was living near you at the time. And this was when I was still thinking about, should I write this book? Should I do it? Um, and I was really asking you kind of the central question of like, what is the most important thing to do with my time? Like, how do I know? And I remember asking you, you brought up, when I brought that question to you, you brought up the idea of death as an advisor. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that first, how we can use um, death to help us navigate figuring out what is the most important thing.
Yeah, yeah. I think, our death it's the ultimate wake-up call. And Carlos Castaneda, who famously said, keep death on your left shoulder as an advisor. The death is always your death, your personal death is always there within arm's reach. So whenever you have a decision to make, pause deeply and ask your death for advice. What a radical practice. I mean, what a radical practice. Because when you realize that everything is just tick tock, poof, the other day, because I've wrestled too, like, should I write a book? Should I, all that sort of stuff. And the other day, I was driving up our driveway, and I was listening to NPR, and they were talking about the death of someone I hadn't heard of before, who had published 40 books.
Wow.
And I realized 40 books, and I've never heard of her. Who in the world do I think I am that it's life or death that I write this book or not? It was such a really, really helpful kind of reframe. So when we really contemplate that, it just wow, it just opens up all kinds of new possibilities. And for myself, my grandfather, this amazing guy, his father um, grew up in Alsace in eastern France, and because he was born Catholic, was the firstborn male he was supposed to go into the priesthood. He kind of ran away. He came to the States. He was a mercenary in the Civil War. He was wounded in the Civil War, had a whole bunch of kids, and then died. So my grandfather grew up in Southern Illinois, speaking only German, absolute poverty. Put himself through college, put himself through engineering school, and then left enough money for his grandchildren to go to private school. So I was able to go to prep school. I was able to go to college, all because of this guy who, I mean, the last time he saw me, I was like 4. And I'm so touched by that, to that sense of like, with death on your left shoulder, what legacy do we want to leave? You know? And I love that whole idea in the Native American tradition. When you make a decision, you think of 7 generations from now. How will this decision impact them? It is such a powerful way of opening up all kinds of new possibilities.
Yeah.
And and as I know, that whole thing of the greatest regret of the dying. the number one regret of the dying, according to this person who sat with thousands of people dying, is I was not true to myself. So it opens up that whole deep, deep inquiry around like, what is it that I can't not do? And I love that. I love that question. And I think for you with your book, ultimately, you just couldn't not
Mhm.
do it.
Yeah,
Is that right?
yeah, and same thing with this podcast. I just that's how I knew to do it next of, like, I keep talking about this, I keep wanting to do this, and that's okay, that's how I knew it was a next step.
And I like that as a definition of, dharma is, a couple interpretations of dharma. Dharma is eternal truth, perennial truth, but it's also the unfolding of your path. And I love that definition of your path is what you can't not do.
Mhm,
The idea of choiceless choice. So, yeah, you have options, but when you really get down to it, this has got your name on it.
mhm,
But getting to that place of quiet and stillness is part of the work.
right. Um, I mean, I feel incredibly lucky that because of certain privileges and luck meeting some skill that I've been able to engineer situations where I can go after the most important thing to me. But I can see that a lot of people listening might be thinking, okay, yeah, nice if you happen to be like a self employed creative who can go after your bliss and take those risks. But what if you have a family to support? What if you are in a situation where people are actively trying to prevent you from living your truest expression of your life because they're oppressing you? So yeah, I guess I just wanted your thoughts on is thinking about this question of what do you most want to do and being able to make that choice, is that a privilege or can anyone do this?
That's a great question. You know, I, because I think it's a two-part question. In some ways, you can look at it as a two-part question. The first one is, what do you really, really want? And the second question is, what are you willing to give up to get it? And inevitably, you know, quite often where we kind of get fractured is we're not willing to give up. We're not willing to give certain things up in order to get what we really, really want. And I think for some people, absolutely, there's this sense of privilege, and it always struck me like I always wanted to write a book. And I noticed that most of the people I knew who were writing books, either were professional creatives or they had trust funds, or they were in academia where they were kind of underwritten to be able to do it. But like I had to work. I didn't have time, you know. But I also know that if I had really, really wanted to do it, I might have made it happen. I'm not sure. But getting really drilling down into that really becomes is a really, really powerful question. I know from my father who was working on his PhD with 4 kids, at one point decided, "My family's I don't wanna miss my kids growing up." And so he suspended his PhD, and then he didn't complete it. I'm not sure he regretted that or not, but, it becomes this very deep process of self-inquiry around what are my commitments? What are my responsibilities? What do I really want? How do I balance that? It's a fascinating inquiry. It really is.
So it's kind of given the cards you've been dealt, what do you want? Is sort of the caveat. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or the situation you find yourself
Yeah.
in um, that maybe has factors outside of your control. What I'm hearing is you're saying you can still, within that, figure out what your aspirations are, I guess.
Yeah, and again, I think it comes down to form and essence. We have an idea of the form. We think we know what it looks like, but then the essence is what it feels like. You know, it's the difference between I want to create a massive nonprofit and have huge global impact, as opposed to, well, I don't have the means for that, and I have this other job I need to do. Is there a way that you can cultivate the inner feeling of that? where you're serving and you're coalescing people around serving, and maybe it isn't a massive thing, but maybe it still has that feeling where you're fully aligned in the expression of it.
Mm, that's a good distinction, yeah.
So that becomes an interesting, yeah, it's I think is a really cool distinction because we have an idea in mind, you know, but what we're really looking for is the feeling.
Mm.
Anyway, that's my hallucination of it.
No, I really like that distinction, and, I think I was sort of aware of that the whole time I was working on my book, but then having it come out is another thing of just, "Oh, here's this other reminder of, I did the thing that had been a dream and a goal for so long, and it did make me, quote unquote, make me happy in certain ways, and in other ways not, and felt very anticlimactic. And wherever you go, there you are. You can achieve this external thing, but it was such a reminder of even when you do the external thing that you've most been working towards and that you most think is going to bring you that sense of um, recognition or feeling safe because now you've arrived some way, or um, like, oh, okay, now I can relax because I don't have to plan for this future thing because I did what I wanted to do. That, like you've talked about, there's always going to be the next thing to do. Um, so really, again, it's the, I guess, also that question of, and what would that give you? What did I hope that embarking on this project would give me? A sense of being helpful. Um, what is really at the core of that, and how can I maybe make
Hmm.
that feeling less dependent on external achievements? I think is a good question. Um, yeah.
Well, having poured all of yourself into your book, and in retrospect, now that it's been out for a while, and when you look back, do you have what was it? What was the essence you were? What was the feeling you were looking for? And I'm just curious. You said a little bit about it. Like, what's the delta between the feeling you were looking for and the feeling you
Hmm.
got?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking. Let me think. Hmm. It was a lot of different things. It's hard to distill it down to one thing. I don't know, should I name the few different things that it was? It's hard for me to distill
Yeah, I think that would be great. I would love to get the kind of the
it.
scattershot sense of feeling you were looking for, because I would imagine it's quite many different
Yeah.
feelings.
I was hoping to be helpful to other people, to help them feel less shame or less alone, um, in a variety of different situations. I was hoping to come back to a sense of self respect and trust in my own abilities and mind after that had been very eroded by someone else's opinions or telling me I wasn't capable. So I guess there was a sense of wanting to prove something to myself about my own capacity, my own bravery. Um, I guess I wanted to challenge myself creatively, and see if I could do this thing I'd always dreamed of. And then, if I'm honest, on the less admirable side, I guess I was hoping that it would afford me a continued freedom to not have to work for other people, to be able to structure my days as I pleased, to be able to have my lifestyle um, align with my values, I guess, of having, this desire to have more, I guess, control over my time. That's arguably, uh, it's understandable, but I've also heard people argue that that's kind of a fallacy in itself because time is not a thing you can own or control. But there's the real reality of, do I
Mm.
have to, um, you know, be reachable on Slack all the time to my boss or not? And there was a real feeling of like, I don't want to do that anymore. I want to be answering just to myself.
And how much of that actually came into fruition?
I mean, I think all of it did to a large degree. Um, I think that where the lesson was that I got it for a couple years, which is incredibly lucky, but then the question becomes, okay, how do you keep it going? And will I be able to make a living off of this in the future? Will I be able to um, keep enjoying that freedom? So then there's this ironic sort of need to keep planning or keep living in the future in this way that I was hoping I would liberate myself from. Um, but I feel like, well, in order to keep being able to live this extraordinarily liberated professional life, I have to stay one step ahead of myself almost. So it's like this
Mhm.
catch
Yeah,
22 a little bit.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, no, first of all, how wonderful that, that you were called, like mm, those feelings that were really pulling you into the future really came to fruition. And what a wonderful thing to celebrate,
Yes.
And then along with it is that sense of like, well, so now the goal is still slightly out of reach, you know? Like I just noticed for myself. I mean, it's just God, how old am I now? Like, why is it that my to-do list is always a little bit more than what's reasonable? You know? There's always that inner sense of like, it's not I'm not okay. I've got to keep stretching. And if I'm not stretching, if I'm not pushing myself, and for many people, if I'm not on my own case, then I'm going to slack off and I'm going to fail. It's fascinating to me how that works. Yeah. You know, the teacher, Sri Tony Robbins Das, tells this story of he was leading this seminar on like success, and he raised a hand like, who thinks you're successful, and he saw some extremely successful looking people, and only a few handful hands went up. And he went to this one guy who looked like killer successful. And he said, "Do you mind if I interview?" And the guy said, "No, go ahead." He said, "What do you do?" He goes, "Well, I do investment banking." He said, "What did you make last year?" He said, $2.7 million. And he said, "Do you exercise?" He goes, "Yeah, I actually run marathons." He said, "Do you have kids?" He goes, "Yeah, I got two kids. They're in Ivy League schools." I said, "So you call yourself you're not a success?" He goes, "No." He goes, "Why not?" And he goes, "Well, I play golf with these guys who make more money than me. Um, I run marathons, but my body fat is 0.2% off my goal. And my kids are in college, but my son is majoring in history, which is a waste of time. What's he going to do with that?" So he thanked him and he went to and he saw a guy had his hand up. He said, "Can I interview you?" And he goes, "Yeah, sure." He goes, "What do you do?" He goes, "Well, I drive a city bus." So what'd you make last year? He goes, $36,000. He said, "You have kids?" "Okay, yeah, I got some kids there in public school." And he said, "Do you exercise?" "No." Yeah. He said, but you raised your hand as a success. Why?" And the guy said, "Where I come from, every day above ground is a good day." I think it's back to that whole thing of death as an advisor, and the underlying angst that we have that I'm not enough. This is not enough. It's a fascinating thing to really, really bring that forward. And I would imagine for you, Rachel, to find that balance of, you know, like to really be creative is such a radical, radical thing, as you know. And to really create your life where you're not hindered by the anxiety and fear that shuts that creativity down is part of the dance, I think.
Yes. Yeah, thanks. Um, that actually reminds me of, I think, the second part of when I first met you and you told me about uh, you know, this concept that we were just talking about of death as advisor. And I said, yeah, that makes sense to me. And in a lot of ways, I sometimes feel like because I experienced a loss at a young age of my cousin who was killed by a drunk driver when she was 12 and who I was very close to, like a sister. I've been contemplating my own impermanence since a pretty young age and thinking about death and feeling a sense of time is very short. And so sometimes I think I've actually almost um, moved even faster than I wanted to out of that sense of death as advisor always on my shoulder. But I think that also sometimes that has driven mostly in my 20s in the period I talk about in the book, less so now, but still some like a period of hedonism. I don't tend towards nihilism, but a sort of question of like, well, if this is it, if I'm really not sure there is any other chances at this, and this very blip of life is all there is, um, yes, I have these values that I want to help people, and that gives me meaning, and I want to be creative, but I don't know, maybe I'm playing this all wrong. I should be living in the cheapest beach town possible and working as little as possible and just kind of doing a lot of hallucinogenic drugs and having like, just kind of existing as much as and just enjoying myself. Like, what if the point is just to um, enjoy myself? Because I think you asked me as I was trying to decide, you were like, well, what would be really fun? Like what? And And I thought, well, lots of different things would be really fun. That's kind of the whole problem is I feel like there's so many different paths I wanna take. So yeah, I guess I wanted to ask about um, when death is our advisor, what if we find that that leads to a kind of bucket list mentality or sort of feeling of like, I just need to do a bunch of things because time is running out, and then we sort of end up missing the point because we're, yeah, chasing after rainbows.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, what a great inquiry. Yeah. Yeah. Chasing lights and rainbows, which I describe that as, the first 3 quarters of my spiritual career, was chasing states, you know, and it's a fascinating thing because, well, there are two things. One thing the Buddha allegedly said was if you think you can achieve happiness or realization by indulging the senses, you may find that that doesn't pan out. But if you think you can find happiness or realization by denying the senses, you might find that doesn't work either. And it becomes I really love that because I've definitely done both extremes to extremes, in my inquiry around how to navigate this life. But where I find myself, I love this quote from E.B. White, which I quote maybe too much, where where he wrote, "I wake each day torn between a desire to serve the world and to savor it. This makes it difficult to plan the day." And I really find like between those two, my life flows. I because there are definitely times of like, what I don't want to miss the beauty of what's here. And at the same time, I get a very, very deep satisfaction around around what at least feels to me like authentic connection and being supportive and, you know, helping other people kind of wake up to the miracle of this life. But any one of those out of balance is not healthy, because it's very easy to get lost in service and miss the joy of life, and very easy to get distracted into the hedonism life as well. And it's kind of back to that the truly exquisite teaching in the Buddhist tradition of that middle way. It's this very, very delicate place of balance that I think what we're really looking for quite often is the sense of balance.
Yes. I think that's really well put. And I think you have a line that you say sometimes of, I don't remember it right, so I'll just prompt you of like, we have this built in uh, barometer that's, what is it, like unhappiness or something? I'm forgetting exactly how you put it.
Yeah, I think it's like this, yeah, this deeply customized feedback loop from the universe to let us know when we're out of balance, called suffering.
Suffering.
You know, you know, and it's just right there. And if we're really, really sensitive, we'll get little nudges. And if we're not, we're going to get a 2x4 across the
Hmm.
face. It seems to be.
Yes, right. That makes a lot of, yeah, sense, the suffering. So, yeah, that with finding that balance of savoring and serving, that one way to figure out how to walk that line, of course, is to cultivate mindfulness and equanimity so you could just have not get hit by the truck in your mind of like of just only when it's very extreme offs that you're more attuned to those subtleties of when you're off balance in the first place, um, and that you can see your suffering more clearly, basically. So you could use that as the
Yeah.
barometer of, oh, I'm getting a little too rigid, a little too focused on my service or my, external goals, and it's time to savor a little. Or, oh, I'm getting a little like depressed and lethargic. There's some suffering here of knowing I'm not reaching my fullest, inner potential, I guess, or that I'm becoming too
Hmm.
self-focused, I'm not giving back enough. um yeah, that we could use that as a way to navigate walking that line, and that, like you said, it's never going to be a fixed thing, that it's always this dance, it's always going to be
Yeah.
changing, and even this idea of what do we want is always going to be potentially shifting in subtle ways, that it's useful to consistently check back in with that question.
Yeah. It's always a moving target. Yeah. And that sense of mindfulness as a process of self diagnosis, I find very, very interesting. So what's happening? And it's not just can I be with it, but how does this want me to be with it? Can be very, very helpful. And when I realize, oh, what do you know? I'm really caught in hypervigilance and anxiety and restlessness. Wow, maybe some concentration would help to calm me and help me to arrive. Oh, I'm really, really fixated, and I'm really, really grim. Wow, maybe I need to relax and open up. So it's that process of cultivating that middle way it becomes a really fascinating way of practicing. And kind of as a callback to our kind of our initial part of our conversation is we can ask ourselves at any moment, what's the most important thing right now? And just that question, and then the pausing and the listening becomes a very powerful opportunity for just being, maybe just for a micro moment, being a little more awake, opening up our awareness out of the linear to a much more of an intuitive space.
I think that a lot of people, myself included, struggle with the fear of, okay, if I ask myself that question, like, what's the most important thing right now? There's a fear of letting go of the inner taskmaster voice that might be very well intentioned and trying to, you imagine, is trying to like keep you on the path that's aligned with your aspirations. So it might be like, if I ask myself that question on a given afternoon, what's the most important thing right now? It could be like, I don't know, like sometimes I'll have conflicting answers to that, right? It could be like to stare at a tree, or it might be like, yeah,
Hmm.
to work on the podcast and like do that piece of the work that maybe is not as fun to you, but because ultimately the most important thing is you want to put this out and be helpful. And there's a kind of fear of like, if I don't push myself in the moment to do something I might not feel like doing, or that might not feel like in that moment is aligned with the most uh, present, open way of being that I'm gonna lose track. So, I mean, I guess I can see how it comes back to the same answer of just cultivating that sense of sensitivity of when it's time to push and when it's time to rest. But I know you've talked a lot about that in specific episodes on the podcast that are very helpful. People can look up, but maybe give them a taste of some strategies for like developing that sense of when it's time to, yeah, rest versus push.
It's very challenging in this culture to really have that sense of flow, where you can just really trust that, oh, here's this organic wave of creativity that I need to express. Oh, here's this organic sense of depletion that's really calling for me to, you know, just to pause and allow myself to get restored. You know, we live in such a digitized, compartmentalized world that it's very, very challenging. And when we lose because we're out of touch with ourselves and we don't trust ourselves. The whole idea of like, hey, if I stop criticizing myself, I would never go to work again. That's sort of where the mind tends to go. Like if I'm not standing over myself with a cattle prod, nothing's going to happen here. And so that becomes a very interesting part of the inquiry as well. But also when we look at our conditioning and we really have a sense of like these forces that are driving us, the desire for success, the desire for fame, the desire to win, the desire for pleasure, the fear of failure, the fear of blame, the fear of shame, the fear of loss. If we're not aware, those are referred to as, the eight worldly winds in Buddhist philosophy, that here we are on this tightrope, this razor's edge tightrope, trying to cultivate spaciousness and equanimity and be in the flow. And then here come these winds that are just tearing at us. And the more identified we are with a self who's trying to win and afraid of losing, who's trying to be well known and loved and is afraid of shame, to that degree, we're not going to be tuned in, you know. So that's such a big part of just essential mindfulness practice and sort of deconstructing that, you know, all those forces inside. As I've shared, I know some extremely successful people in life who are completely, utterly driven by the fear of failure. They're all their success and all their worldly wealth has behind it this absolute fear of failure. And there's really, really deep suffering in there.
Yeah. Hmm. Um, I wanted to talk about the idea of, well, maybe that some positive thinking or very successful people might spout of like, you should do what scares you. Um, and I found in life that there is like a grain of truth to that, that kind of like both you can do what you feel like you can't not do, like you said, but also that often the thing you can't not do is hard, or it's a little there's something a little vulnerable and scary about it. So I found there to be some truth, but I can also see
Mhm.
how, I don't know, like that idea could also be problematic of, again, why does it need to be this struggle? Like shouldn't it be the thing that feels kind of
Yeah.
natural to do, and then that wouldn't scare you? So I'm curious what you think of that idea.
Has such a juicy inquiry, because most of us we've got really deep fears, deep inset fears, and like anxiety has been a big part of my life. And I actually spent a lot of my life being unconsciously kind of counterphobic. Like if I was afraid, I would march right into it. If I felt anxiety around rock climbing, I was going rock climbing. You know, if I felt at all nauseous around doing whitewater kayaking, guess what? I'm going to become a whitewater kayaker. And there was something helpful about that, but also something really dumb about that. But what I find is, you know, so there are all these somethings inside, something inside, is aware of anxiety. Something inside has a real aversion toward the anxiety. But what has really helped me again, because I tend not as much, not even a third as much. But when I see something, part of me is called to it, but also part of me is really anxious. Is it's really, really helpful to slow down and really inquire, what do I need to do this? Like what's the unmet need that would support me in in exploring this? And generally, there are a couple unmet needs that I might have. If I remember one time I was invited to, give a conference at a university and, give a presentation at a university, and part of me is like, yeah, I'll be there. And then this kind of unsettled anxiety, like, why did I even say yes? I'll just tell them I didn't get the emails, and I won't show up or or whatever. And then when I really slow down, that's what do I need? It's like, oh, I need to know who I'm talking to. I need to know what level of aptitude do they have. I need to know like where I'm going to be. And then when I ask myself, well, if those needs were met, would I want to do it instantly? I really did want to do it. So I find it so interesting to kind of explore, and then the different traditions will tell you different things, like if you see a fear, turn toward it and run toward it. mm, yeah, I'm not so sure. But I think if you see a fear, get familiar with it, I find to be a lot more interesting. As the Buddha allegedly said, it's familiarity leads to wisdom.
Mm.
So I find for myself, wherever there's anxiety, if I can just get familiar with it, get to know it, get a sense of it, get a sense of like what's the unmet need that's creating this feeling inside. If I can name that, I find that to be tremendously helpful. And then sometimes I can realize, like, you know what? I don't have to do that. Part of it was to prove I could do it to myself. And I realized, I really don't have to do that. I actually started off across the Sahara Desert on my bicycle, knowing it was a stupid thing to do, but also knowing that on some level, like I had to do it because I was terrified of doing it. And later realized I was the one who was completely making it up. you know, I'm curious what your take is to that, because as a creative, that you sense there are things that attract you, and then obviously they must have some form of anxiety or fear toward them. How do you kind of massage that process for yourself?
Hmm. Thanks for asking. Um, I think that I try to lean into vulnerability, but also listen to physical cues. So if my health or sleep or anything else is starting to suffer, that's a sign to pull back. I think that also asking and learning to ask for lots of help from other teachers, from the
Mhm.
psychologists that I both, my counselor, but also all the ones I interviewed throughout the process of writing the book, that made a really big difference. A sense of community made a really big difference in being able to just have more capacity to navigate these things and to remember that I was not on my own in whatever I was facing, that in some ways to look for echoes of that in other writers' work, other people's work, um, to remember it's never like my journey alone is helpful. But I guess
Mhm.
I was also thinking about like what's on my mind right now. Obviously, I have this tendency, like you, to kind of lean into the exploration. And a lot of this first book was about my journey with, non monogamy and really pushing myself kind of beyond the limits of what was um, comfortable or sustainable, was part of what I needed to go through to kind of realize and value equanimity more. Um, and now, you know, I don't know what the next book will be, but one of the main ideas that I felt myself coming back to kind of runs along the same line of immersion journalism and really confronting what is the place that most scares me. When I dig underneath and underneath it, it usually comes back to my fear of death, and fundamental discomfort with um, the possibility of non existence and just a total absence. And, you know, I think like I've recently pulled back from the idea of pursuing that too aggressively because I've kind of thought, well, like when I'm ready, it'll start to feel like the thing I can't not write about or do. And then last night,
Mhm.
I woke up, and this doesn't usually happen to me. But last night, for whatever reason, I woke up in the middle of the night, probably some dream I had, seized with just the crushing reality of my own impermanence and my own finite time on earth and my sheer terror at the idea that, yeah, this is it. And that I really want to believe there's something, some way my consciousness will continue after this, but a real part of me just doesn't, just really thinks that this is it and is fundamentally not okay with it. And so then I thought, oh, that's funny. You're about to talk to Jonathan about like what's the most important thing, and death is your advisor. So I'm thinking in that case, it's like, okay, there's this very clear answer of like, here's what I need to reconcile and confront. And the whole thing is that there's a limited amount of time to do this. That's that's kind of what the whole
Yeah.
terror is about. But at the same time, I
Right.
also feel how like I don't know, like maybe that's not gonna, if I'm scared of it, like why am I pushing myself right into the heart of thinking about it all the time? Is this really a tendency in myself that's healthy, or will I kind of
Hmm.
almost perseverate further by trying to confront head on my fears?
Interesting. So part of it is sort of a reflection as to your sort of almost like your character, your personality. It's been said like with in the Four Noble Truths, the first that suffering, stress, dissatisfaction, suffering are part of the human experience. The second that there's a cause, which is identification and clinging. The third that you can let go, and the fourth that there's a path and practices and observations that help you to let go. It's been said that people tend to fall into two camps. There's one camp that's really tends to focus on the first two, and the second camp that tends to focus on the second two. And I find that really, really interesting because it's incredibly helpful to really look at like the source of suffering, but a little too much and that gets very grim. And it's also really, really interesting to really explore the practices of release and letting go. But too far on that side of the equation, then that sort of leads to spiritual bypassing and premature transcendence, you know? So finding like that right balance for yourself is really juicy. And also, it's an interesting question again for you between form and essence. It may be that the form of a book might actually be the format that actually kind of sets you up to do a really, really deep investigation. Or it may be that it's what you're really seeking is just the feeling of moving deeper into that very, very powerful investigation.
Mm.
Either way, sounds like there's something calling
Yeah,
you.
yeah, yeah. It's great advice. Thank you. Um, One question I was asking my friend, "Oh, do you have anything you want me to ask about this?" And she said, "Well, does he have any advice for when you're sort of like caught between two or more ideas that seem like they would both be good, like that they would both be aligned with your meaning, they have different pros and cons. Like, how do you kind of navigate those situations where you need to compare or make decisions?"
Yeah, that's kind of my specialty. You know, um, the we talk about the three poisons of the mind through Buddhist philosophy. There's sort of like there's greed, which is a wanting, 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 and then there's aversion, which is judgment, anger, blame, pushing away, and then delusion, which is kind of confusion. And it's been said like they kind of show up in different personality types. Sort of the greed type, which is just always hungry for new experiences, the aversive type, which is very, very good at like stepping back and looking at things from a distance. And then the sort of deluded or confused type is, they can generally be really fun at parties, because they're just kind of in the moment, but they might not have real discernment. And I know for myself, being a poster boy of the greed type,
Same.
it's like, yeah, exactly. It's like, well, I haven't done that yet, you know? It's just to be aware of like there's a lot of desire in there. So just being on to that, I think, can be really, really helpful. But also, I think for me, as a really good friend of mine who got really sick of me talking about the next thing that I might do, he said, you can do anything, but chances are you can't do everything, which was really, really helpful advice. And then it came down to like, okay, so if I really settle as to what most engages me, because it kind of plays into the fantasy part of the mind, sort of the self-soothing, oh, I could do this, I could do that, the sort of almost a disassociated state. The other thing I find helpful for myself is to really include my body into the decision making. That whole idea of like the body doesn't lie. It's going to really give you feedback. So when I think, okay, so let me just think about that. If I really did that, if I really committed to that, if I told my body, this is what I'm going to do, what signals am I getting from the inside? And that has been tremendously helpful for me to take sort of like a conceptual thing I've been just literally playing with, and then to really bring it into that whole somatic inquiry, to really sense if I can get some kind of realistic feedback from that whole sense of like kinesthetic intuition has been super, super helpful for me.
Yes, that's great advice.
And a lot of times I find when we have a whole bunch of ideas and we're not sure yet, what I've really come to recognize is, well, maybe the reason I can't make the decision yet is I don't have enough information. And that's been really helpful for me. It's just given me a little more patience to really explore my options. Um, so that's just another angle would want to offer there
Mhm.
too.
Great. That's really helpful. I mean, I feel like we've
Yeah.
covered a lot of ground. I don't know. Nothing else is immediately coming to mind as pressing around this, but is there something else you feel like you should add on the topic or a way to kind of summarize? I feel like you sort of did just summarize some of the main takeaways, but if there's anything else we should kind of leave people with.
Well, I think it's sort of like going back to the original question around what's the most important thing. I think that there's to take the time to ask that question is so rare. There's this whole model, where you break your time out into four quadrants. One quadrant is all the unexpected crises, that show up. The phone call you got to make, the email you have to respond to. The second quadrant is everything you said you were going to do, which is usually beyond what's reasonable. The third is like strategic planning, like is what I'm doing this week really aligned with where I want to be in 10 years? That's very rare. And then the fourth category is it's presence. It's pausing, and it's more than just pausing or mindfulness. It's poetry, it's nature, it's that stuff that just feeds you on such a deep, deep cellular level. And what I find for my life and for many, many people is that if I don't prioritize quadrant number 4, then all of my attention slides into quadrant number
Mhm.
1, where I'm just a reaction machine in life. And I think there's something about that question, what is the most important thing? To nail yourself against the wall, and to really call on death as an advisor. They're deeply, deeply cathartic questions that acquire a lot of firepower to kind of stay in that question. But it's so worthy, because what it will take us ultimately to is more and more of a sense of what it is we can't not do. More and more of a sense of that, of what the path that's here in front of us. it can be grueling, but it's the most rewarding game in town, as far as I
Mm,
can tell.
yeah. I love that idea of those
And I really
quadrants.
admire Rachel
Oh,
how
no, sorry, go ahead.
it's so like that's such a helpful model, such a helpful model. And I really appreciate how, how just how deeply you have been engaged and living your path with so much integrity.
Well,
You've been a real a model and an inspiration.
thank you. Likewise, back to you. I appreciate how you've helped me have these conversations, and your podcast has helped me immensely, which is also on YouTube. Is there any that I feel like every episode you've done is like some is helpful in some way to everything we've been talking about, but if people are looking to delve into this topic even further, are there any specific ones that come to mind that I should specifically link to in the show notes or something?
Wow, boy.
Yeah, I know there's so many.
I feel like when I look back, it's just this fire hose of talks out there.
I can look it up.
There's one that sticks out as I think it's called like One Question Can Change Your Life, which is kind of along these lines, but there's a podcast by something by that
Okay.
title, you know, that I'm really into the power of questions these days. It's a fascinating thing. Like the power of pausing and asking these questions and letting the questions turn us inside out and reveal what's there. That's just so juicy.
Yes. Oh, well, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. Um, and this is actually just one point I was thinking of that I could maybe cut and paste somewhere else and get your thoughts on. But I really appreciated the book 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Berkman that I read recently, that I think you would love if you haven't read it. And it's really a lot about this tendency to feel like we have to keep taking more on and kind of living in the future and keep clearing the decks and be productive, um, and then we'll arrive. And so it obviously spoke to me. And one thing he pointed out that I found helpful and that I've been returning to, and that I was thinking of when you were talking about the stuff in that quadrant of the things that just feed us, um, being in nature, being still, that we almost have to be careful that we don't also turn those into more things that are like to make us better at working or better in a self-improvement way constantly. Like, it's I don't think it's bad to have an aspiration to improve, but he talked about how, like, it's getting increasingly rare that we do things just for the sheer pleasure of doing them and not on some level for self betterment, even when it's like the relaxing activities. Or you might go on a walk and be like, I'm on my mindful nature walk, and this is another thing I'm checking off my list of how to be a well rounded person. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, I've just found that to be a good reminder, too, of like, am I doing enough or fully giving myself permission when I do the relaxing things that feed me to really do that to no other end? Like, even though I know it's going to help me
Yeah,
in these other realms.
it's so true. The mind is just so unbelievably neurotic. Okay, I had my savoring time. Let me evaluate that. How much did I savor on a scale of 1 to 10? How much did I lose myself in the mystery of life? Let me rate that. Let me journal about that. It's just crazy, isn't it? Oh my. God bless us all.
I mean, I think it's definitely probably a certain type like us that does this more. But yeah, it's
When I lived in an ashram, you know, everyone was so into like so frightened around not getting enlightened. I had this great idea, which was a sign up list saying, sign here for a deeply humiliating but potentially enlightening experience. And I knew if I put that up, it would be filled up. It's pretty amazing, isn't it?
that's like a great, slogan for what life is, like a potentially, or a deeply humiliating but potentially enlightening experience. But I also liked the joke I think I've heard you say of like life is a sexually transmitted disease for which there's no cure.
Exactly.
So yeah,
Exactly.
we can have a sense of humor about
Yeah.
it all.
Oh man.
All right.
We have to. We have to. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so
Well,
much.
so good
You
to be with you.
too.